The summer of 1944 brought with it a heat that seemed to press down on everything it touched. Along the hedgerows of Normandy, where ancient stone walls divided fields that had known peace for generations, the air now carried a different weight. It was thick with smoke, heavy with tension, and punctuated by the thunder of artillery that rolled across the French countryside like an endless storm. In one of the countless gun positions dug into these hedgerows, a young man named James McCarter stood beside a howitzer that had become both his tool and his burden. At 23 years old, he was the loader for a 105-millimeter howitzer crew in the United States Army's 1st Infantry Division. His hands, calloused and scarred from months of handling ammunition, moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared another round for firing. But efficiency, James had come to realize, was not the same as effectiveness. The gun crew had been firing almost continuously for 3 days. Their target was a German position roughly 4,000 yards distant, nestled in a grove of trees that provided both cover and concealment. The forward observers had called in the coordinates. The gunner had made his calculations. The rounds had been sent downrange with all the speed and fury that modern warfare demanded. And yet intelligence reports suggested that the German position remained largely intact. The shells were landing, certainly. The explosions were real enough. But they were scattered, inconsistent, creating a pattern of destruction that looked impressive from a distance, but failed to achieve the surgical precision needed to neutralize the target. James had been watching this pattern for days now, and something about it troubled him deeply. It wasn't just the waste of ammunition, though. That was concerning enough. It was the knowledge that somewhere on the other end of their firing solution, there were soldiers counting on this artillery support. Men who were risking their lives, believing that the guns behind them were providing accurate covering fire. The relationship between an artillery crew and the infantry they support is built on trust. That trust, James understood, was only as good as the accuracy of the shells they sent downrange. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the gun crew took a brief respite from firing, James found himself studying the breech mechanism of the howitzer with unusual intensity. The other members of the crew were taking advantage of the break to eat, to smoke, to write letters home. But James remained at his position, his mind turning over a problem that he couldn't quite articulate but felt in his bones. Sergeant Thomas Riley, the gun's commander, noticed his loader's distraction. Riley was a veteran of the North African campaign, a man whose weathered face bore the marks of too many close calls and too many friends lost. He had learned to read his men the way a farmer reads the sky, looking for signs of storms before they break. "Something on your mind, McCarter?" Riley asked, his voice carrying the rough edges of a Chicago upbringing. James hesitated. In the military, particularly in combat, there's a fine line between useful observation and unwanted criticism. But the sergeant had asked, and James had been raised to speak truthfully when given the opportunity. "Sergeant, I've been thinking about our firing patterns, the way we're loading and firing. There's something about the rhythm that doesn't feel right." Riley's eyebrows rose slightly. In his experience, loaders worried about speed and efficiency. They didn't usually concern themselves with ballistic theory or firing patterns. "Go on," he said. James chose his words carefully. "We're loading fast, Sergeant. As fast as we can. That's what we've been trained to do, but I've noticed something. When we fire rapidly, when we're really pushing the pace, the gun doesn't have time to settle between rounds. The recoil system doesn't fully reset, and I think that might be affecting our accuracy." It was a simple observation, but it carried implications that went against everything they had been taught. In artillery training, speed was emphasized as a crucial factor. The ability to put rounds downrange quickly was considered a mark of a well-trained crew. The doctrine was built around the idea that more shells in the air meant more impact on target. But what if that doctrine was wrong, or at least incomplete? Riley was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from James to the howitzer and back again. He had seen enough combat to know that the classroom and the battlefield were two very different schools, and that sometimes the most important lessons were learned by questioning what you thought you knew. "You're talking about slowing down our rate of fire," Riley said finally. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It was an invitation to elaborate. James nodded. "Not drastically, Sergeant. Just enough to let the gun fully recover between rounds. I've been timing the recoil mechanism. It takes about 4 seconds to fully reset after firing, but when we're at maximum speed, we're loading and firing again in less than 3. I think those missing seconds might be costing us accuracy." The theory made a certain mechanical sense. The 105mm howitzer was a sophisticated piece of equipment designed with precision engineering. Its recoil system was meant to absorb the tremendous forces generated by firing and then return the gun to battery, ready for the next round. But that process took time. If you interrupted it by firing again before it was complete, you were essentially asking the gun to fire from an unstable platform. Riley had been around artillery long enough to know that precision was a product of consistency. Every variable that you could control, you should control. And if James was right, they had been introducing an unnecessary variable by prioritizing speed over mechanical stability. "You understand what you're suggesting," Riley said. "If we slow down, we're going to take criticism. Battalion is going to want to know why our firing rate has dropped." "Yes, Sergeant, I understand that. And if you're wrong, if this doesn't improve our accuracy, we're going to look like fools." James met his sergeant's eyes steadily. "And if I'm right, Sergeant, we're going to save lives." There it was, the fundamental truth that made the risk worthwhile. This wasn't about proving a theory or winning an argument. It was about the possibility that they could be more effective at the one job that mattered, supporting the men who were fighting and sometimes perishing just beyond the horizon. Riley made his decision the way he made most decisions, with a combination of instinct and pragmatism. "All right, McCarter, we'll try it your way. Next fire mission, we adjust our timing. 4 full seconds between rounds, but this stays between us for now. I don't want the rest of the crew second-guessing themselves while we're testing this out." The opportunity to test James's theory came sooner than expected. As dawn broke over the Normandy countryside the next morning, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold that seemed almost obscenely beautiful given the circumstances, the radio crackled to life with new coordinates. A German counterattack had been detected forming up in a tree line approximately 5,000 yards from their position. Intelligence suggested it was a company-strength force, possibly more. The artillery was being called upon to disrupt the attack before it could gain momentum. Riley gathered his crew around the howitzer. The gunner, a thin man from Georgia named Davies, was already working his calculations. The assistant gunner was preparing the aiming stakes. The ammunition handlers were bringing up rounds from the concealed supply dump. "Listen up," Riley said, his voice cutting through the morning air. "We're going to adjust our timing today. 4 seconds between rounds, no less. I want this gun fully settled before we send the next shell down range." There were questioning looks, but no one challenged the order. In combat, you trusted your gun commander, and Riley had earned that trust many times over. James took his position at the breech, his hands already reaching for the first round. It was a high explosive shell, one of dozens that looked identical, but each of which carried the potential to change the course of a battle. The forward observer's voice came through the radio, professional and calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Fire mission, enemy infantry in the open, coordinates as follows." Davies worked his magic with the firing tables, translating the coordinates into the angle and elevation needed to drop shells precisely where they were needed. The gun was trained and elevated. The gunner checked his sight one final time. "Gun ready," Davies reported. Riley gave the command. "Fire!" James loaded the first round with movements that had become second nature. The breech closed with a solid mechanical click. The lanyard was pulled. The howitzer roared, the sound of it so loud and so familiar that it was almost comforting in its intensity. And then James did something that felt unnatural. Instead of immediately reaching for the next round, he waited. He watched the recoil mechanism work. He saw the gun slide backward against the resistance of the hydraulic system, saw it pause at the limit of its travel, and then saw it smoothly return to battery. 4 seconds. It felt like an eternity in the context of rapid fire, but when James loaded the second round, the gun was perfectly still, perfectly aligned. There was no residual vibration, no mechanical uncertainty. The platform was as stable as it had been for the first shot. The crew continued firing, maintaining the new rhythm that James had proposed. It felt slower, uncomfortably so for men who had been trained to see speed as a virtue. But there was something different about this fire mission, something that became apparent when the forward observer's corrections came through the radio. Adjust fire, add 50, right 20. Small corrections, very small corrections compared to what they were used to. The crew made the adjustments and continued firing. The morning air filled with the sound of their work, a steady rhythm that was perhaps less frantic than before, but no less purposeful. After 12 rounds, the forward observer's voice came through again, and this time there was something different in his tone, something that might have been satisfaction or perhaps surprise. Fire for effect. Excellent shooting. Keep it up. Fire for effect. The words that every artillery crew wanted to hear, the confirmation that their shells were landing where they needed to land, that the enemy was being engaged effectively. The crew continued their mission, sending round after round downrange with the new timing that James had suggested. The rhythm became natural, the 4-second pause between shots transforming from an awkward interruption to a measured cadence. When the fire mission ended, when the last round had been sent, and the gun fell silent, Riley stood looking at his loader with an expression that mixed respect, with a kind of bemused wonder. "McCarter," he said, "I think you might be on to something." The proof, as it always is in military matters, would be in the after-action reports. When those reports came through the next day, they told a story that was difficult to ignore. The German counterattack that had been forming up had been broken before it could even begin. The artillery fire had been so accurate that it had caught the enemy in their assembly area, inflicting significant casualties and disrupting their organization completely. More importantly, the observation reports indicated that the distribution of shell impacts had been notably tighter than previous fire missions. Instead of being scattered across a wide area, the rounds had fallen in a concentrated pattern that maximized their effectiveness. Word of the improved accuracy spread through the battalion. Other gun commanders wanted to know what 1st Gun had done differently. Riley, to his credit, gave full credit to James for the observation and the theory behind it. But understanding what had worked was only the first step. The question now was whether this technique could be replicated, whether it was a fluke specific to one gun and one crew, or whether it represented a genuine improvement in artillery doctrine. Captain Richard Harrison, the battalion's fire direction officer, was a man who had taught gunnery at Fort Sill before the war. He approached the problem with the methodical mind of an engineer and the practical sensibility of someone who understood that theories meant nothing if they didn't work in the field. Harrison came to visit Riley's gun position on a warm afternoon, bringing with him a notebook and a genuine curiosity about what his crew had discovered. James explained his observation again, this time with more confidence than he had felt when first raising the issue with Riley. He talked about the recoil mechanism, about the importance of allowing the gun to fully reset between rounds, about the hypothesis that mechanical stability led to improved accuracy. Harrison listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he was thinking through the implications. When James finished, the captain was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the howitzer, as if seeing it with fresh perspective. "The doctrine we've been following," Harrison said finally, "was developed largely based on World War I experience. The emphasis was on putting up a wall of steel, on saturating an area with fire. But the targets are different now. We're not firing at trench lines and no man's land. We're firing at mobile targets, at defensive positions, at enemy formations that can move and adapt. Precision matters more than it used to." He turned to face the gun crew. "I want to conduct some controlled tests. Same gun, same crew. But we'll vary the firing rate and measure the impact patterns. If this technique holds up under controlled conditions, we need to be teaching it to every crew in the battalion." Over the next week, James and his crew participated in a series of firing exercises that were designed to test the slow loading technique against traditional rapid-fire methods. They fired at target arrays set up in a field behind the lines, with observers carefully plotting where each round landed. The results were striking. When firing at maximum speed, the shells showed significant dispersion. The pattern of impacts was scattered, with some rounds landing as much as 50 yards from the aim point. But when the crew maintained the 4-second pause between rounds, allowing the gun to fully reset, the dispersion dropped dramatically. The shells clustered much more tightly around the target, with most impacts falling within 25 yards of the aim point. A 50% improvement in accuracy. In artillery terms, that was the difference between effective fire and wasted ammunition. It was the difference between neutralizing a target and merely annoying it. But the tests also revealed something else, something that James had intuited but hadn't fully understood. The improvement wasn't just about letting the recoil mechanism reset, it was also about the crew itself, about the human element in the firing equation. When rushing to achieve maximum firing rate, the crew members were more likely to make small errors. The loader might not seat the round perfectly. The gunner might not allow his sight to fully settle before calling ready. The assistant gunner might rush the final alignment check. These were tiny mistakes, each one individually insignificant, but they compounded over multiple rounds to create significant dispersion. The 4-second pause eliminated the rush. It gave each crew member time to perform their tasks with precision rather than speed. It transformed the act of firing from a frantic race to a measured ritual. Captain Harrison compiled his findings into a report that went up through channels to division headquarters. In that report, he made a recommendation that was both simple and revolutionary. Artillery crews should prioritize accuracy over rate of fire. A slower, more deliberate firing technique produced better results than rapid fire in most tactical situations. The report might have been buried in the endless paperwork of military bureaucracy. Recommendations from the field often were, particularly when they challenged established doctrine. But timing, as in so many things, proved crucial. The Allied armies were preparing for a major offensive. The breakout from the Normandy beachhead was imminent, and with it would come the need for artillery support that was both massive and precise. The artillery commanders were looking for any edge they could find, any technique that might improve the effectiveness of their guns. Harrison's report landed on the desk of a colonel who understood the value of what he was reading. Within days, the slow-loading technique was being disseminated throughout the division. Gun commanders were instructed to implement the new timing to give their guns time to fully reset between rounds. Not everyone was convinced initially. There was resistance from crews who had been trained to see speed as paramount, from officers who worried that slower firing rates would mean less support for infantry advances. But the proof was in the performance, and as more crews adopted the technique, the improvements in accuracy became undeniable. James McCarter, meanwhile, found himself in an unusual position for a young enlisted man. He was asked to brief other crews on the technique, to explain the mechanical reasoning behind it. He spoke to rooms full of artillerymen, some of whom were skeptical, others who were curious, all of whom were ultimately interested in anything that might help them do their jobs more effectively. He discovered that he had a gift for explaining complex mechanical concepts in simple terms. He could break down the physics of recoil and recovery into language that made sense to men who worked with their hands and trusted their instincts. But more than that, he emphasized something that resonated with every artilleryman who heard him speak. This wasn't about making their jobs easier, it was about responsibility. Every round they fired was expensive, both in terms of resources and in terms of the faith placed in them by the infantry. They owed it to those men to be as accurate as possible. The technique that came to be known simply as controlled timing spread beyond the 1st Infantry Division. Other units heard about it and began experimenting with it. Artillery schools started teaching it as an alternative to rapid fire. It became part of the growing body of tactical knowledge that was being developed in the crucible of combat. The summer of 1944 gave way to autumn, and the war ground on through France and into the Low Countries. James and his crew continued to serve their howitzer, continued to send shells downrange in support of men they would never see, but whose lives depended on the accuracy of their fire. They participated in the liberation of Paris, their guns firing in support of the forces that pushed into the city. They fought through the bitter autumn rains that turned the roads to mud and made every movement a struggle. They endured the cold of an early winter that seemed determined to freeze the life out of anyone foolish enough to be caught in it. And through it all they maintained their controlled timing. 4 seconds between rounds. Time enough for the gun to settle, for the crew to prepare, for precision to triumph over haste. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 tested every artillery crew on the Western Front. The German offensive struck with a fury that caught the Allied forces off guard, and suddenly artillery was one of the few things standing between the attacking German forces and a breakthrough that could change the course of the war. James and his crew found themselves firing in conditions that were almost impossible. The snow was falling so heavily that visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The cold was so intense that it threatened to freeze the recoil mechanism, requiring the crew to constantly maintain the gun to keep it operational. Forward observers were calling in fire missions faster than they could be processed. The radio chatter was constant, urgent, filled with the kind of desperation that comes when men are fighting for their lives. And yet, even in the chaos, even in the fury of defensive fire that was all that stood between success and catastrophe, the crew maintained their discipline. 4 seconds between rounds. It had become more than a technique. It had become a commitment to doing the job right, even when everything around them was falling apart. The effectiveness of their fire during those desperate December days was reflected in the reports that came back from the infantry positions they were supporting. The artillery fire was described as accurate, consistent, and literally life-saving. Shells were landing where they were needed, breaking up German attacks before they could gain momentum. One particular incident became part of the division's unofficial history. A German armored column had been detected moving through a narrow valley, presenting a perfect target for artillery if the fire could be accurate enough. The valley was only about 100 yards wide, with steep sides that would prevent the tanks from maneuvering if they came under accurate fire. James's gun was one of 4 assigned to the fire mission. The forward observer painted a picture of the tactical situation that made the importance clear. If they could catch the armor in that valley, they could stop a breakthrough. If they missed, if their shells fell on the slopes instead of in the valley floor, the tanks would continue their advance unscathed. The firing solution was calculated with extreme care. The range was over 6,000 yards, at the edge of the howitzer's effective range. The conditions were terrible, with wind and snow affecting the shells in flight. But the crew had confidence in their technique and in each other. They fired their rounds with the measured timing that had become their standard, 4 seconds between each shot, giving the gun time to settle, giving themselves time to ensure each round was loaded and prepared correctly. When the forward observer's report came back, his voice carried a kind of awed respect. The rounds had landed in a tight pattern right in the valley floor. The German armor had been caught in a concentrated bombardment that had destroyed several tanks and forced the survivors to retreat. The breakthrough had been stopped. "Outstanding shooting," the observer had said. "I don't know how you dropped them right in the pocket like that, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it." James had allowed himself a small smile at that moment, despite the cold and the exhaustion and the constant threat of German counter-battery fire. They had done their job. They had done it well. And somewhere out there, soldiers who would never know his name had survived because of the precision of their fire. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and with it came the slow process of demobilization and the return to a world that seemed almost impossibly peaceful after years of constant conflict. James McCarter returned home to a small town in Pennsylvania, carrying with him memories that would never fully fade and an understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. But the story of the controlled timing technique didn't end with the war. In the years that followed, as military analysts studied the lessons learned from the conflict, the importance of artillery accuracy became increasingly clear. The data showed that units which had adopted the slower, more deliberate firing technique had achieved significantly better results than those which had emphasized rapid fire. Artillery doctrine was revised to reflect these findings. Training programs were updated to teach controlled timing as a standard technique. The emphasis shifted from rate of fire to accuracy of fire, recognizing that precision was more valuable than volume in most tactical situations. The technique spread beyond the American military. Allied forces that had fought alongside American artillery units adopted similar methods. Even the Soviet Union, which had built its artillery doctrine around the concept of massed fire, began to recognize the value of accuracy in certain tactical situations. In the decades after the war, as artillery technology advanced, the principles that James had recognized remained relevant. Modern fire control systems and precision-guided munitions would eventually take accuracy to levels that seemed impossible in 1944. But the fundamental truth remained. A gun firing from a stable platform was more accurate than one firing in rapid succession without time to fully reset. James McCarter never sought recognition for his observation. He returned to civilian life, worked as a machinist, raised a family, and lived a quiet life that bore little outward resemblance to his time in the war. When people asked about his service, he would tell stories about the men he had served with, about Sergeant Riley's leadership, about the harsh winter of the Bulge, about the relief they all felt when the war finally ended. But occasionally, usually late at night when the house was quiet and memories had a way of surfacing, he would think about those 4 seconds. 4 seconds that had seemed like an eternity at first, but that had made all the difference. 4 seconds that represented the difference between doing a job and doing it right. The howitzer crews that came after him, whether they knew his name or not, were his legacy. Every time an artillery crew took that extra moment to ensure their gun was fully settled before firing, every time precision was chosen over speed, they were implementing the lesson that a young loader had learned in the hedgerows of Normandy. In military history, there are many stories of great generals and brilliant strategists, of pivotal battles and decisive campaigns. These are the stories that get told and retold, that become part of the official record of how wars are won and lost. But there are other stories, too. Stories of ordinary soldiers who noticed something, questioned something, had the courage to suggest that there might be a better way. These stories are often forgotten, lost in the vast machinery of military bureaucracy and in the passage of time. James McCarter's story is one of these. It's a story about observation and critical thinking, about the courage to challenge accepted doctrine when you believe something is wrong. It's a story about a young man who understood that his job wasn't just to load shells as fast as he could, but to help his crew fire as accurately as possible. It's a story about 4 seconds that changed artillery doctrine and saved uncounted lives. The principle that James discovered in 1944 remains valid today, encoded in modern artillery doctrine and taught to every generation of artillerymen. The technology has changed dramatically. The old 105mm howitzers have given way to sophisticated self-propelled artillery systems with computerized fire control and precision-guided munitions. But the fundamental truth remains. Accuracy matters. Stability matters. Taking the time to do something right matters more than doing it quickly. In an age where speed is often valued above all else, where faster is assumed to be better, there's something profoundly important about this lesson. Sometimes slowing down is the fastest way to achieve your goal. Sometimes patience is more effective than haste. Sometimes 4 seconds of waiting can be worth more than any amount of frantic activity. The soldiers who fought in the Second World War are increasingly passing into history. The veterans who can tell their stories firsthand are fewer with each passing year. But the lessons they learned, often at terrible cost, remain relevant. James McCarter's insight about artillery firing technique is one of thousands of such lessons, small pieces of knowledge gained through observation and experience, tested in combat, refined through practice, and eventually incorporated into the body of military knowledge that helps keep soldiers alive and missions successful. It's a reminder that innovation doesn't always come from the top down, that the people doing the work often see things that others miss, that listening to good ideas, regardless of where they come from, is essential to success. It's also a reminder of what war really is, stripped of glory and romance. It's men and women doing difficult jobs under impossible conditions, trying to stay alive, trying to help their comrades stay alive, trying to accomplish missions that they're given with whatever tools and knowledge they have. James McCarter didn't set out to revolutionize artillery doctrine. He was just trying to do his job better. He noticed something, thought about it, and had the courage to speak up. That's all. But that was enough. In the summer of 1944, in a gun position in Normandy, a young loader counted to 4 between rounds. It seemed like a small thing, insignificant in the vast scope of global conflict. But those 4 seconds represented something important. They represented thought, precision, care, commitment to excellence, even in the chaos of war. They represented the difference between doing a job and doing it right. And in war, that difference is measured in lives saved, missions accomplished, and battles won. The story of James McCarter and his slow-loading technique is ultimately a story about the power of observation, the value of questioning established methods, and the importance of prioritizing effectiveness over appearance. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes the most important innovations are the simplest ones, that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, and that taking the time to do something right is always worth it in the end. As the sun set over the Normandy countryside on that summer evening in 1944, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, James McCarter stood beside his howitzer and counted to 4. It was a small act, repeated thousands of times in the months that followed. But in those 4 seconds was contained a lesson that would echo through generations, a truth that transcended the specific circumstances of its discovery. Quality matters more than speed. Precision matters more than volume. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is slow down and do things right, even when everything around you is screaming for you to move faster. That lesson, learned in the crucible of combat, tested under the worst conditions imaginable, and proven through countless fire missions, remains as relevant today as it was nearly 80 years ago. It's a lesson that applies not just to artillery, but to any endeavor where accuracy and effectiveness matter. In the quiet that followed the war, in the years when memories faded and life moved on, that lesson endured. It endured in the training manuals that taught new generations of artillerymen. It endured in the doctrine that guided how artillery was employed. It endured in the lives that were saved because shells landed where they were supposed to land. And it endured in the memory of a young man who counted to 4, and in doing so, changed the way a war was fought. The howitzers that James McArthur served have long since been retired to museums or melted down for scrap. The battlefields where he fought have been reclaimed by nature, the shell craters filled in, the hedgerows restored. The world has moved on, as worlds do, to new conflicts and new challenges. But the principle remains. In artillery doctrine, in military training, in the collective knowledge of how to employ firepower effectively, there is embedded a simple truth that came from a loader in Normandy who took the time to think about his job and had the courage to suggest a better way. 4 seconds. A pause that felt unnatural at first, but that became the rhythm of excellence, a moment of stability in the chaos of war. A small innovation that made a large difference. That's the story. That's the legacy. And that's why, decades later, we remember the name James McArthur and the technique that doubled firing accuracy by the simple expedient of slowing down and doing things right. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all. Not just for artillerymen, not just for soldiers, but for anyone who wants to be effective at what they do. Take the time. Be precise. Let the platform settle. And then, when everything is ready, when everything is right, execute with confidence and skill. 4 seconds that changed everything. 4 seconds that remind us that sometimes the fastest way forward is to slow down. 4 seconds that represent the difference between good enough and truly excellent. That's the story of how one loader's slow artillery technique doubled firing accuracy. But more than that, it's a story about the power of observation, the value of questioning, and the enduring importance of doing things right, no matter how much pressure there is to simply do them fast. As the last light faded from that Normandy sky all those years ago, and as James McArthur prepared for another night of war, he couldn't have known that his simple observation would become part of military history. He was just trying to do his job better. But in that attempt, in that commitment to excellence, even in the worst of circumstances, he created something that would outlast him and everyone he served with. He created a lesson that endures, a truth that remains. A reminder that sometimes the smallest changes can have the largest impacts, and that the courage to question established methods is one of the most valuable qualities a soldier or anyone can possess. 4 seconds. Count them out. Feel how long they are, how much can happen in that space. And remember the young loader who understood that those 4 seconds were worth more than all the frantic speed in the world. That's the story. That's the truth. And that's why, even now, artillery crews around the world sometimes pause and count to 4, honoring a tradition born in the hedgerows of Normandy and proven in the fires of war. The technique that doubled accuracy, the insight that saved lives, the lesson that endures, 4 seconds that changed everything.